to Let's Talk AppSecOps. My name is Mark Lambert, VP of Products here at ArmorCode, and I'm joined by my good friend, Luis Guzman. Luis, how are you doing?
What's up, Mark? How's it going?
Very good, as always. Okay, so we want to talk today a little bit about how can you shift left, right? And it's an overused buzzword in the market, so we'll kind of break it down a little bit. But really, the fundamental problem here is that developers are overwhelmed with steaming piles of manure, lots of data, okay? And, SaaS tools that we leverage, I think we might have talked about this before about, like if they're not configured properly, they're just noisemakers. And, also, they find weaknesses, not vulnerabilities. So in itself, the data is not as high fidelity as it is further on the right. So the further right you go in the process, the closer the finding or the vulnerability, the finding maps to an actual vulnerability. And the more context it has to say, look, this is actually real in your environment. So what can we do to look right and use that data to help us shift left? So we can focus the developer productivity. We can get good return on our investment of time. We can prioritize properly with the development team and give them context from the tools that are on the right, which they don't use because it's further right. They may not even have access to it. Definitely are not a product expert in it. But how can we map that to the context of the tools that they do use? And that big pile of data, how can they pull out the golden nuggets from it? So
is the big pile of data also the big pile of manure? I'm just trying to make
it is.
Okay.
That's exactly it.
So the lack of context, I think that's what we need to kind of focus on here, right? Because them not being able, and them I mean developers, developers not being able to understand the context because they're working in an environment that is very much about incentivizing a certain type of behavior, and that's usually speed, right? Yeah. So speed doesn't always pick up on the context, right? So let's say you're driving down the road. If you're driving 40 miles an hour, you might be able to look over to the side and say, oh, look, there's a bird, right? You go 80 miles an hour, and then if you're Mark, you're doing 120 in your Porsche, and you look, you can't see anything. It's all blurry. And so
you don't look left or right.
You can't look left or right because you're going too fast. That's exactly right. So that analogy right there points to maybe if we just slow down a little bit so that we can get the context of what we're about to do, so that we can then produce something that's going to be of quality as opposed to quickly producing something that may just be quiet. Right. And I know that's a little bit different than what the market's used to, but at the same time, if we're in the cloud, we're spinning up and spinning down quickly, ephemeral, right? One day it's here, one day it's not. So then you look back and you're like, well, there's no vulnerability there. No, it's because that asset just disappeared. It didn't mean that the vulnerability went away. The weaknesses are still there. Next time that asset comes back, it's going to be there staring us right in the face.
Yeah. And I think this has been an age-old thing since Agile started, right? It's like speed of delivery of functionality versus mitigating the business risk. And I think the key thing that we need is visibility, right? Because if you are just saying, look, I've got a pile of 1,000 vulnerabilities, what am I going to do? Well, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take whatever the tool gives me, and I'm going to look at the most critical thing that tool gives me. But if that tool doesn't have the context of how your application is working, you're still sifting through a whole bunch of critical data that could actually, you're trying to still find the nugget. Whereas if I can combine that with the data from the right, I look right and I bring that data in, I can contextualize it further and I can bring to the top still probably those critical things, or maybe even some of the high things that have actually been exploited, or I have CVEs that are linked to CWEs that I can take that data and elevate it up. I think that is the critical first step. It's visibility, it's scoring for prioritization, and using that to kind of like bubble up so that you're spending not hours and hours on security. You shouldn't be doing. It should be a small amount of your time, but you want to make sure that amount of your time, and you said them for developers, right? I have the development background, so I'm them and you're us. Okay, thank you for
Yeah.
that. You just talked to the friction between development and security.
We've said it.
But it gives me the ability to spend my precious time appropriately because I still have core deliverables.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that right there, that understanding of the priority that we were able to get from the context of what was actually happening in my environment, having an understanding where it logically leads us to the proper conclusion, not illogically saying, if I hear, the hoofbeats, right? What is that? If I hear hoofbeats, it's not zebras, it's horses, right? So you should look for the horse first. And talking about horses and understanding that context and all of this information that came in from the pile of data that you mentioned.
Oh, I see what you did there. You brought us all
that?
the way back home to the beginning.
And
okay.
now we're right back to where we started, where we're like, all of that has to work together because we're moving so quickly in the environment that we're in today, where we talked about how fast we go into the cloud and get out of the cloud.
Yeah.
On a second per second basis.
I think we're onto something. You know what? I think we should start a business. Oh, hold on a minute. We work for a company that does that. So, shocker. Okay. All right. Well, I think that's a wrap. I mean, I think, when you're walking across the DevOps street, make sure to look left and look right. Thank you, Luis. Thanks, everyone, for watching. Stay tuned for our next episode.